Hello, this is Ed Kilgore, the principal blogger at the Political Animal blog, and welcome to this week's Washington Monthly Show. My co-host today, since Paul Glasters is on vacation, is Steve Waldman, who's a former editor of the Washington Monthly and an old friend. He's written a couple of important books, worked at a lot of important places, and is also the founder of Beliefnet. Steve, it's really great to talk to you again, and glad you're going to be participating in Paul's absence this week.
Well, thank you for having me. Very, very good. And I think you're the best political blogger on the internet these days, and I'm proud that the Monthly has you, and good to be with you today.
Great. We've had some technical problems, which is why I'm holding this landline receiver up to my head. I hope it's not a distraction, but we'll go right ahead with our show. I will note that we're again bi-coastal. Steve, you're in Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
And
Fourth largest city in America.
We're in the greater Monterey area of California, so we've got the country covered. Coming out of the weekend, there are kind of large political stories in both parties surrounding the presidential nomination campaign, which is red hot, even though we're still a few months from the first voting event, the Iowa caucuses. Speaking of Iowa, candidates from both parties are doing the traditional visit to the Iowa State Fair this week, where the candidates are so thick on the ground you got to stir them with a stick. And we may talk a little about that. But Steve, I think towards the end of last week, there was what I could only describe as sort of a full-fledged panic going on among some Democratic elites, or at least reporters covering Democratic elites, about Hillary Clinton's standing in the polls, her ability to win a general election, and in general, we're a long way from the coronation talk of just a few months ago. Do you think Hillary's in serious trouble?
It's really hard to tell in August whether these things have permanent effects. And I've always been persuaded by your arguments in the past that if you're focusing on the fundamentals versus the game-changing moments of the day, that the fundamentals are more important. And that with Hillary,
right,
the fundamentals still seem to be strong. I mean, in a nutshell, the case for Hillary always was and still is that she could preserve the Obama coalition and maybe add to it a little bit by getting some white working class women. And if she did that,
right,
she wins. And I don't see anything that is busting that up. But it is interesting to speculate that even with having said all that, it is possible that Bernie Sanders could win the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. And then,
I agree.
And then, sort of fundamentals aside, you sort of like, whoa, that would be a big deal. I'm not sure exactly what happens in that scenario, but what do you think?
Well, I think normally that would be a pretty big, not necessarily a clincher, but certainly a danger sign for anyone who had been the front runner and went into the contest, assumed to have a big advantage. But on the other hand, if you look at the strengths and weaknesses of Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, it just so happens those first two contests are kind of, Bernie paradise. You've got a virtually all-white Democratic electorate in Iowa, where activist energy and organizational ability is all important. And then the first primary in New Hampshire, also nearly all white, in the state next door to Bernie Sanders' Vermont. And all along, the big question about Bernie has been, does he really have any appeal to to minority voters that are so extraordinarily important after New Hampshire, particularly the southern and big state primaries? Precisely because he's from Vermont, and also because he sort of espouses this old school democratic socialist kind of economic deterministic approach to politics, does that really have any natural appeal to minority voters, particularly against Hillary Clinton, who a lot of people have forgotten that until Barack Obama jumped into the race in 2008, and even for a while after that, she was pulling 60 and 70% of the African American, and she won the Latino vote against Obama in 2008. So even if Bernie wins those first two states, he's still going to have to show the ability to, win that very important portion of the Obama coalition, and that's totally aside from Hillary's advantages in elite support and money.
And I guess the question is, even given that, let's say that that's true, that she remains just as strong in the southern states or with African Americans or Hispanics as ever. If you do have that moment where Hillary Clinton has just lost the New Hampshire primary after having lost the Iowa caucus to Bernie Sanders, will the elite freak out get to such a level that someone new comes in or, something dramatic happens? And it almost reminds me a little bit of 1968 when Eugene McCarthy kind of upended Lyndon Johnson, and he didn't end up as the nominee, but it so disrupted the moment that Bobby Kennedy got in and Hubert Humphrey got in, and everything just got scrambled. And so McCarthy's role was not to become the nominee, but to break it up. And I guess that is plausible if Sanders wins Iowa and New Hampshire.
Well, to complete the analogy, you'd have to have Hillary Clinton playing LBJ, withdrawing from the contest, which is obviously happening.
Right,
and
that's
then,
a good point.
Where's the Bobby Kennedy candidate?
It's not Joe Biden.
I do not think it is Joe Biden. I mean, I think there's a scenario where if something really bad happened to Hillary Clinton's campaign, let's say she was indicted, or there was a really clear, not just a conservative agitator's evidence of a serious national security breach and all these emails, then I think at that point you could be looking at a party-wide search for an alternative to Hillary. Not the sort of insurgency that Bernie Sanders represents. I mean, in that case, you could be looking at a draft Elizabeth Warren effort. But I think to displace Hillary Clinton at this point, if she's not willing to go quietly, is really hard to imagine with all the advantages she has. And again, I don't think Joe Biden is the answer. His political base is pretty close to hers. He has his own disadvantages, including age. And truth be told, he doesn't look any better. He doesn't look that great in polls against the Republican candidates either. So, I think part of this media-generated part of the Democratic panic, revolves around finding other candidates that could theoretically run and finding somebody who will say off the record that they're thinking about it. We've seen that with Biden. We've seen it with Al Gore. We'll probably see it with John Kerry. But that doesn't make it real.
I agree. So let's talk about go from the real to the surreal over on the Republican side.
Yeah.
I think it's really time that we dropped the prefix that we always have on every sentence. Every conversation about Trump always starts with, well, of course, he can't possibly win, but, and the but might be, he's tapping into an important strain. He could overturn some of the other candidates. I think it's time to actually entertain the possibility that Trump could actually win the nomination. I'm not saying it's the likely scenario, but there's a false premise to the whole thing, which has always been, well, Trump, to be sure, has a passionate base, but so many people hate him that he's never going to get above 30%, 35% tops.
Yeah.
and therefore
Yeah.
he couldn't win. And
Well, you made a case actually at Washington Monthly on Friday as to why we need to stop thinking that way. You want to kind of lay out your doomsday scenario?
well, to some degree, it's a math problem. It's that the way things. It is true. The last few decades is that the nominee was someone who ended up with majority support, but that was because a certain domino effect always happened, where someone would pull in the lead. They seem to have a relatively commanding lead. The rest of the pack can no longer raise money effectively. Then their support dries up and they drop out, and you end up with one or two candidates going off against the guy with the strong base. And so
The winnowing effect, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it is Citizens United. Is you have the possibility of 3 or 4 or 5 people running at 10, 15, 20% who normally would have to drop out. But this year they don't have to drop out because they have their pet billionaire who can keep them in it. So that's kind of the whole premise: is can the billionaire buddies keep the candidates 3, 4, and 5 in the race long enough, picking up 10%, 15% here and there, so that a guy with a solid 30, 35% can win. And, this has happened before in history. I mean, in 1972, McGovern won the nomination with about 25% for all sorts of reasons that are unrelated to what we're talking about now. But it at least illustrates the math point that someone with a third of the vote can win as long as other candidates stay in long enough and have a kind of baseline of support.
Yeah, it's certainly theoretically possible. You do. In 1972, I think there were more winner-take-all primaries than we're likely to see this time around, and that's another way that somebody with 25 to 30% of the support can get a majority of the delegates. And then I guess the other question is whether even if the super PAC billionaires keep people in the race longer than they might have in the past, let's remember that these nomination contests usually end very early. Right. I mean, it seemed like the 2012 Republican contest took forever. It was actually really over in March. I tell you something that I think intrigues me almost as much as Donald Trump's numbers, and it does go to this sort of maybe false assessment of what Republican voters actually want this year. The first post-debate Fox News poll of the field came out, and I normally don't pay too much attention to these horse race polls, but there's one kind of shocking aspect of this one that actually Matt Iglesias pointed out this morning. If you look at the vote going to Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, and Mike Huckabee, it's a majority of Republican voters. If you look at the votes going to Jeb Bush, Scott Walker, Marco Rubio, and John Kasich, supposedly the only candidates that the party elites consider even possible, even worth thinking about, they have 26% combined. So, the way I put it in a post this morning is that the wacko bird vote, Mike Huckabee has been just absolutely nuts, in my opinion, in this particular cycle. His last big pronouncement was that he'd be willing to use the FBI and the military, to stop all abortions in this country. I guess by arresting women and jailing them. I don't know. Ted Cruz, if you look at those 4 candidates that I just mentioned, Trump, Carson, Huckabee, and Cruz, Ted Cruz could be the moderate in that group. So is there something going on here beyond this sort of magical or diabolical appeal of Donald Trump that we ought to be looking at instead of just his numbers? That's what I keep wondering.
Well, you wrote a piece a while back that I think probably gets at some of the issue, which is when white working class voters shifted to the Republican Party, for a number of elections, they were able to kind of paper over some of the economic and policy differences between they're newfound members of the coalition and the folks that have been there all along. And this year, it's all coming out in the open. And some of what you're talking about is not even so much insider outsider, although that is a big part of it, as this white working class voter that had been a relatively new entry into the coalition is starting to strut its stuff. And there's some real differences.
My theory, and again, there's some polling data to support this, but it's not really clear yet. But, in some respects, what the Trump vote, if you want to call it that, but again, I would expand it to some of these other candidates who are non-orthodox Republicans. They kind of remind me of the Wallace vote in the Democratic Party back in 1972. Now, when's the last time there's been a Blogging Heads TV episode with two different 1972 analogies?
I think it's going to be a big crowd favorite.
Oh, yeah, I think so, too. Anyway, white, non-college educated voters who, back in 1972, were culturally alienated from the message of the Democratic Party, even if they were still sort of Democrats on economics. Well, now there's a large number of white, non-college educated voters who are routinely voting Republican now, or voting in Republican primaries, whose basic bond with the party is cultural, and who have never quite identified with the economic views of Republican elites. And they're an extremely important part of the Republican electorate now. I mean, Donald Trump is clearly aiming at this constituency. I've seen some polling that suggests that's really his base. One Washington Post ABC poll about a month ago showed that in a three-way candidate general election against Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, Donald Trump would get 31% of the non-college educated white vote, which is just astonishing. This is a vote that Republicans need to carry with about 60% to win. Is that a comment for the peanut gallery there, Steve?
The mailman just rang the doorbell, and so our dog is commenting. Right. No, he was not commenting on Trump.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Anyway,
apologies.
Mike Huckabee originally in this campaign was talking the same way as Trump is about economic issues. Both of them are opposed to that great Republican elite theme of entitlement reform. Both of them oppose the kind of trade agreements we've been seeing. And obviously both of them oppose the sort of the business elite approach to immigration reform. So there may be something going on here that's bigger than Donald Trump. And if that's the case, even if Trump, fades or gets bored or finally commits the gaffe, the gaffe that's sort of the political equivalent of the sin against the Holy Ghost, I'm not sure what it would be in his case. He's survived so many, but even if all these things happen, there's something going on in the Republican Party that indicates that they may not be satisfied with, settling for Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or even Scott Walker, just because Republican elites tell them those are their choices.
Well, and as has been pointed out in the past, there have always been issues where the Republican Party leadership has seemed to take positions that were at odds with the Republican electorate. And they tended to be issues where, like immigration, where you had the business community that was pro-immigration. And it created these difficult situations for Republican politicians who understood that the base was more anti-immigrant, but the donor class was more pro-immigration. Well, maybe this is a case where Donald Trump's wealth has liberated him to be actually more in touch with the Republican electorate. He doesn't care about the Republican donor class. He doesn't care about that. So he's free to go farther on immigration than other Republicans have.
Yeah, I guess we are getting close to that point where, the tribunes of the Republican establishment, including all the political scientists who think that Jeb Bush is still the overwhelming front runner because he has endorsements from members of Congress, party leaders, and that sort of thing. We're going to have to start asking themselves, when is this going to be evidenced? When are we going to see the weight of opinion that the party leaks, really begin to matter? To me, the big asset that Jeb Bush has is not just money, but the apparent willingness of the people running his big super PAC, which has about $110 million in the bank right now.
Which is way more than anyone else, right?
Way more than anybody else. Maybe way more than anybody's ever raised, at least at this stage, is willing to, take on a sort of Visigothic set of negative attacks on other candidates, thus driving down their numbers and presumably making Jeb the last candidate standing. There's a lot of evidence that that's exactly what they're planning to do, and let's remember that's sort of how Mitt Romney survived in 2012 after an awful lot of predictions that he was just too moderate and too damaged, to be the Republican nominee. And he managed to get to the right of Rick Perry on immigration. He ran negative ads, turning even Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich into sort of, rhino wimps. So is that if that's what we're about to see, strategically, what do you do if you're in the Jeb Bush camp and do you go after your friend Marco Rubio? Do you go after Scott Walker? Do you go after the people that you've always been told and have assumed would be your real nominees? Or do you go after that 52% of the vote right now that's going for what you might want to collectively call the wacko bird candidates? Trump, Carson, Mike Huckabee, and Ted Cruz.
I don't know exactly how you do this, but it seems like the most important priority for him should be to knock out the other establishment candidates, and that
That'd be the savior of the party.
Well, at least be the unified person who's against the wacko bird vote. If you have 4 wacko bird candidates, and then Jeb Bush as the mainstream candidate, or any of them actually. I think this is one of these situations where whoever can consolidate their part of the battlefield fastest is going to have the best shot. So if he were to able to knock out Rubio and Scott Walker and Kasich, and you could say the same thing. At this point, you could say the same thing about any of the others. If you're Walker, you probably are thinking the same thing. You're let's see if we can't get rid of Bush quickly and be the mainstream, alternative to Trump. But that's the problem, is like if they all have the same strategy at the same time, it just means that they, and there's no party boss that's going to come in and tell 3 of them to drop out. So they'll just pound each other for a couple months. And
yeah.
One of the things that I find so amazing about the Trump part of this is he's Mr. Authenticity. People keep saying he tells it like it is, which is really weird because he's a lot of things, but I'm not sure authentic is one of them. He's changed so radically on so many different things in such a short period of time. Normally, someone like that would be mocked as a classic flip-flopper and has no core and all that. And so it must mean something different. When people are saying he tells it like it is, he's authentic, they don't mean it in the way we think. It's not, he has a core and he's always believed the same things, because Trump isn't authentic that way. But so some of it seems to be, a tone. And there was a great quote in a Melinda Henneberger piece about Trump, where she interviewed a bunch of Trump supporters in New Hampshire. And one of them said, "I thoroughly enjoy him not being nice." That was literally one of the reasons that they said. And he actually, this voter, said because you have to be not nice in order to be tough. And you have to be tough to be effective. So his very rudeness and obnoxiousness is coming off as strength and authenticity. That part is very interesting to me, is that rudeness equals authenticity on some level.
Yeah, well, it's also interesting that two candidates that are doing very well right now, Donald Trump and Ben Carson, every third sentence is an attack on political correctness, which seems to have become code language for any kind of restraints, on attacking the godless liberals. In fact, Ben Carson even used political correctness to describe, restraints on using torture in combat. It's we don't have politically correct warfare. So clearly there is some cultural button that both of them are hitting that involves not just being, fighting the opposition or fighting the elites, but, fighting any sort of self-conscious limits on conservative policy. And clearly with Trump, what really started his whole boom is him coming out and saying what an awful lot of Republican politicians were hinting at, that they'd like to deport all 11 million undocumented Americans. Now, the responsible person will just automatically say, well, we can't do that. And Trump said, why not? And that's another thing that kind of reminds me of George Wallace back in 1972. He didn't bother with all sorts of dog whistles. He just came out and said it. The things that a lot of people wanted to hear, whether it was offensive to elites or not. And speaking of Donald Trump saying rude things, I was fascinated over the weekend to discover him coming out and saying something that an awful lot of people were thinking, but nobody on the Republican side, at least, would ever come out and say, which is that Carly Fiorina is not qualified to run for president of the United States. Did you notice that?
No, I missed that. That's
in Iowa, Trump said, well, she's a nice woman, but, she got fired at HP. She did a terrible job there. When she ran for office, she lost in a landslide.
He also...
Both of things happen to be true, but go ahead.
Well, the other thing he said the other day that it was not something that Republicans were allowed to say, was we would have been better off having Saddam Hussein still in Iraq.
Sorry, Steve, I'm losing you there.
He also, the other thing he said that was verboten was that we all would have been better off if Saddam Hussein had not been deposed.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's true, which is pretty interesting since Jeb Bush cannot seem to get himself out of the various logical conundrums associated with, defending his brother's stewardship of the Iraq War without it just reminding people who his brother was.
Right.
And Trump just says, it's all just a mistake. And so far that hasn't disqualified him.
No, I was certainly one of the people who thought he had made a fatal error by attacking Megyn Kelly. And I
thought he had made a fatal error attacking John McCain.
So it's a little hard to see what knocks him down at this point. I mean,
that's what I meant by saying I wasn't sure what the sin against the Holy Ghost would be for a guy like Donald Trump. But
I guess you're gonna
go ahead.
Well, you're gonna. I would think that you're gonna have some of the other candidates start to attack him from the right and say he's for tariffs and tax increases and said nice things about single payer. Rand Paul started to do that a little bit, but there's certainly stuff there. There is certainly material that you can work with, and that's just going to go right to the point that we talked about at the very beginning, which is there's been this assumption of uniformity among the Republican electorate around all issues related to government activism and intrusion. We've just assumed, because it's been so uniform for so long, that there was a coherence to it. and there isn't.
Yeah, well, I know. I'm speaking of Rand Paul. There was a fascinating piece in the Washington Post this morning. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, by Dave Weigel, who's been following Rand Paul for years, alluding back to a very famous piece that was in the New York Times Magazine a little over a year ago called The Libertarian Moment by Robert Draper, which suggested that the libertarian movement had found its, if Ron Paul was its Moses, then perhaps Rand Paul was the Joshua that could get them into the promised land by kind of wearing off the rough edges of libertarianism and making it compatible to mainstream Republicans. Now, just a year later, libertarians are sort of disassociating themselves from Rand Paul, and he's just tanking everywhere. He just had two major leaders of his super PAC indicted. He's not raising very much money. He's sinking in the polls, and there's just a palpable scent of death about his campaign. And again, he was supposed to be the outside the boxes candidate, in 2016, not somebody like Donald Trump or Ben Carson or any of these other guys. Do you have the same sort of feeling that the Rand Paul thing is almost over before it started?
Well, yeah, and he seemed to make a fatal mistake of forgetting why he was popular in the first place. That when he started to hedge and become a little less libertarian or emphasize more conventional things, he then became like the other 16 people and lost any differentiation. I mean, as a kind of market differentiation thing, you would think he'd have a good shot. Not necessarily that libertarians are the majority of the Republican Party, but it's a good, meaningful minority sector. And if he were able to excite them and unify them, he would have been, at a minimum, one of the 4 or 5 candidates who really has staying power. And but that hasn't happened, I think, because he tried to go mainstream too fast, and he lost the enthusiasm and clarity of what his message. The only reason why this one-term senator was being taken seriously in the first place was that he was Ron Paul's son and had a clear line to libertarians. And that was it. And he kind of threw that away by quickly trying to be like everyone else.
I think you're right. Well, we've done a lot of damage to the conventional wisdom today, though, in this conversation, though not as much as, real-life events are doing to the conventional wisdom. So I think we better hang it up for today and get back to our day jobs. I'm about 2 blog posts behind already. But it's great to talk to you, Steve. I'm sure Washington Monthly readers are always happy to have you back in their universe, and let's do this again.
I would love to. Thanks again, and keep up your great work.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.